A police officer sees two men walking back and forth on a street corner looking suspicious. He has no evidence of a crime, but something feels wrong. Can he stop them? Search them? In 1968, the Supreme Court answered this question in a case that changed American policing forever. Today we're examining Terry v. Ohio, the decision that created stop and frisk and established when police can detain you based on suspicion alone. Before 1968, the Fourth Amendment seemed clear. Police needed probable cause to stop and search citizens. Probable cause means there's a fair probability someone has committed or is committing a crime, a relatively high standard requiring concrete evidence. But this created a practical problem for law enforcement. What about situations where officers suspected criminal activity but lacked sufficient evidence for probable cause? Could police act on suspicion to prevent crimes before they occurred? This tension between public safety and individual rights set the stage for one of the most consequential Fourth Amendment cases in Supreme Court history. The story begins in downtown Cleveland on Halloween 1963. Detective Martin McFadden, a veteran officer with 39 years of experience, was patrolling in plain clothes near the intersection of Huron Road and Euclid Avenue. McFadden noticed two men, John Terry and Richard Chilton, engaged in what he considered highly suspicious behavior. Over 10 to 12 minutes, the men walked back and forth along the same route approximately 24 times. They would pause at a store window, peer inside, confer with each other, then continue their pattern. A third man briefly joined them before leaving quickly. Based on his decades of experience, McFadden suspected the men were casing a job, preparing for an armed robbery of the store. Concerned for public safety and fearing the men might be armed, McFadden approached them. He identified himself as a police officer and asked for their names. When Terry gave what McFadden described as a mumbled response, the detective spun Terry around and conducted a quick pat-down of his outer clothing. The frisk revealed a concealed pistol in Terry's coat pocket. Terry was arrested and charged with carrying a concealed weapon. Terry's lawyers challenged the search, arguing that McFadden's actions violated the Fourth Amendment. They contended that without probable cause or a warrant, the stop and frisk was an unreasonable search and seizure. The case presented a fundamental question. Could police stop and briefly detain someone based on reasonable suspicion rather than probable cause? And if so, under what circumstances could they conduct a limited search for weapons? The Supreme Court had to balance competing interests, effective law enforcement and officer safety versus individual privacy rights and protection from arbitrary police intrusion. On June 10, 1968, Chief Justice Earl Warren delivered the court's 8-1 decision upholding McFadden's actions. The court established a new constitutional framework with two key components: investigatory stops. Police may briefly detain a person without probable cause if they have reasonable suspicion based on specific and articulable facts that criminal activity may be occurring. Protective frisks. If an officer reasonably believes the detained person may be armed and dangerous, they may conduct a limited frisk of the person's outer clothing to search for weapons. Warren emphasized that reasonable suspicion required more than an officer's hunch, but less evidence than probable cause. The suspicion must be based on objective facts that would lead a reasonable officer to believe criminal activity was afoot. Applying the standard to McFadden's observations, the court found his actions justified. The men's repeated reconnaissance of the store, combined with McFadden's experience recognizing such behavior, provided reasonable suspicion for the stop. The possibility they were planning an armed robbery justified the frisk for weapons. The Terry decision represented a careful compromise. The court recognized that requiring probable cause for all police encounters would handcuff law enforcement's ability to prevent crime and protect officer safety. However, Warren's opinion included important limitations. The frisk must be strictly limited to a search for weapons, not a general search for evidence. The detention must be brief and conducted in a reasonable manner. Officers must be able to articulate specific facts supporting their suspicion. The court explicitly rejected the idea that police could stop people based on vague hunches or general profiles. The reasonable suspicion standard required objective, observable behavior that suggested criminal activity. Terry v. Ohio remains the foundation of stop and frisk law today. Every police encounter involving brief detention and pat-downs operates under the Terry framework. However, the decision's real-world application has generated significant controversy. Critics argue that the reasonable suspicion standard, being less rigorous than probable cause, has enabled racial profiling and discriminatory enforcement, particularly in minority communities. Studies have shown that stop and frisk practices disproportionately affect Black and Latino individuals, raising questions about whether Terry's practical benefits justify its social costs. The ambiguity in Warren's opinion about what constitutes reasonable suspicion has allowed for varying interpretations by different courts and police departments. Additionally, the narrow weapons frisk originally envisioned in Terry has expanded over time through subsequent court decisions, leading some critics to argue that the exception has swallowed the rule. Terry v. Ohio fundamentally altered Fourth Amendment jurisprudence by creating the reasonable suspicion standard. This middle ground between probable cause and mere observation has become central to modern policing. The decision reflects the ongoing challenge of balancing individual constitutional rights with practical law enforcement needs. While Terry provides tools for crime prevention and officer protection, it also demonstrates how constitutional interpretation must grapple with the real-world consequences of legal doctrines. Understanding Terry is essential for comprehending both police authority and individual rights in America. The case illustrates how Supreme Court decisions shape daily interactions between citizens and law enforcement. Terry v. Ohio created the legal framework that governs millions of police encounters every year. Whether viewed as necessary crime prevention or problematic government intrusion, Terry's reasonable suspicion standard remains a cornerstone of American criminal procedure. The next time you see a police stop, you're witnessing the legacy of two men walking back and forth on a Cleveland street corner in 1963. What other Supreme Court cases shape daily American life? Let us know in the comments and subscribe for more constitutional law analysis.